and elevator people that ran the elevators and janitors, but they had a certain mindset of attainment, which I think was predominant in that early part of the 19th century. And I think it's really important not to just look at Bethel AME Church separately, but in the context of the AME Church and what it sought to attain for African Americans.
It wasn't an economic project. So when I use the expression middle class, it has to do with particular taste, with a culture that comes with reading the Bible, with appreciation for music, the production of music, an appreciation for theater, composing programs that would combine debates, readings, recitations, a blessing. So I still call it middle class, but it's not an economic project, and it's not a project that stems out of money, but it's about a dignified presence, and that came with, you heard me say what Lee thought about how he should look for the position he had. So it's far from economics. It has to do with a dignity that opposes all of the other third-party representations.
And I think if you look at the liturgy of the AME Church, which is very close to the Episcopal Church, which came out of England and which is very, very defined, that the entire essence of what AMEs, starting with the African Society in Philadelphia, were trying to attain. They were kicked out of the white AME Church because they were made to sit in the balcony. And so they started their own church, first with the African Society. And I think it's also important that they were a race-based church. They've always kept the word African in the context of how their church is named, and I think that's very poignant and important in looking at the whole context of why that church still exists today and the historical context of it.
Richard Allen, who founded the church, called it a measured respectability. So he was going to have dignity one way or the other, either with inclusion or separation. But it was a measured respectability.
Yeah, and the idea that what we consider as middle class now, the concepts of middle class was also written into the principles of the church almost at the very beginning. We talk about education, you talk about the arts, you talk about AME was one of the first ones to really start pushing abolitionist movement, prior to, a lot of the other churches. And they also was placed within the church context itself, if they would help themselves. In other words, they bought from each other. If they were craftsmen, they bought from the craftsmen. They supported the education. They supported arts, like you said, the music, but theater, painters, craftsmen, and all that was also part of the support, as well as the concept of missionary with outreach. So this was all within the very context, almost from the very beginning of the establishment of the church. And it is part of the church, is part of how we were traditionally raised in the church. So it looks like it's a middle class, and I guess it's a kind of okay to call it middle class, because that's what it looks like, it's a middle class standing, even though the constituents themselves could be from poor to upper middle class.
Perhaps if you think about the fact that Mother Emanuel in Charleston is an AME church, and you read the record that you presented us, you don't hear Mother Emanuel, you don't hear that kind of militant history of the church coming through. And one of the factors might be when you look at black churches in communities like Champaign, like Oxford, Mississippi, there is a measured, political stance that has to do with a perception of how do we survive. And so I think trying to investigate the consequence of being located where they were and what that did for the, how they expressed themselves politically. I mean, there is a book that I can reference on the University of Mississippi and how that shaped the black community of Oxford that was different from other communities that were similar in demographics and so on.
I just remember growing up in an AME church and spending 14 hours in church on Sunday.
I'm with you.
Question back there, John Green.
Does anybody know, either of you know when African-American students were permitted to live in the residence hall, what year that was?
The first black women were admitted in 1945. So, when did the first black students get admitted to
Was there any documentation about the process that admitted these few early applicants? Did you see any documentation? I mean, we have those records, they're more late, He knew about archiving, he knew about the system, but did you see any documentation, like people that stood out for being able to make the even suggestion or support in written documents that any given African American would be admitted or black person? Was that, do you see any documentation along that line that the school has still or no?
What I did find early notebooks from presidents,
You did.
but handwritten notebooks, small notebooks with the way one does when one is exploring a topic and one starts brainstorming. But it was the framing that I saw, and this was early 20th. The framing was mostly, even late 19th. The framing was, it was framed as a Negro problem, not so much. It was presented as a problem. What do we do? What do we do? And I think I'm even saying this verbatim. What do we do? They're coming to us in big numbers. I'm almost certain I'm saying this verbatim. They're coming to us in great numbers. What do we do? It was most a concern in those terms.
That's what, and they wrote that down.
Yeah,
As
like
a
one
current
would do.
event facing them.
Right, it's like one would do when taking notes or brainstorming ideas to write something, and then those notebooks are kept here as well. I have found those notebooks, and my sense is that overwhelmingly it was about what do we do? What do we do as a university? How do we tend to this problem?
Well, wasn't that part of more of a national framework and context around this in that era? That the biggest problem of the time was the Negro problem. What do you do about this population? So it's interesting to see that you find reference to that, back to Lynn's question, how this local community was dealing with what I'm sure was a broader national context and a national issue.
Yeah, the term Negro problem is actually one in the scholarship.
Here and then back there.
So, you both talk about very remarkable personalities. And if you could bring them forward in time today, what do you think they would think of this University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign?
I know, that's the big question, right? So I would think someone like a Maudel Bousfield, I think she would say that we have definitely made progress, but that there's still much more progress to be made. When we think about the percentages, right? So not necessarily the real numbers of students, because we know that the real numbers have grown quite a bit since the early 1900s. But as far as the percentage of black students and students of color in general at the university, we still have work to do in growing that. And so I think someone like Maudel or somebody like Essie Good would say that, yeah, we've moved the needle a little bit, but there's definitely a lot more work to be done.
I'm thinking about Lee and the way he performed and the way he thought of him with dignity. And many of my students in Virginia come to class dressed with what looks like pajamas. So I think he would be outraged, mostly in terms of this dignity of higher education, the way we dress formally. they used to dress formally, and I think he would be outraged. That's the joke part of it. But I agree. I'm exploring the metaphor in the public, in the work that I'm doing right now, the writing that I'm doing right now. I'm exploring the metaphor of racial traversing precisely because I think about how cautious he was in keeping particular endeavors contained, and I don't think, I had a talk this morning and I was thinking that allowing an African American student to have her lunch at the cafeteria, but only African American students go there, then this isn't quite progress to me. So I think he would also agree that that we need to do more.
I appreciate the talk quite a bit. I was wondering, Tamara, you mentioned Rayford Logan's concept, the nadir, in the period, and the periodization of both of these projects in looking at what might be the racial formation at any particular time, over time, and the changes in the racial formation of the society and how it gets expressed in higher education. And I was wondering if you could say some more about the nadir period, for instance, in which she enters, and yet the period in the 1930s where she's at Chicago, and that's the period where scholarship is now talking about the Chicago Renaissance, the transition from the Harlem Renaissance to the Chicago Renaissance with the great migrations and the radicalization of black working people coming from the South to the North. And then they're coming down here as well, some even stopping on the way up to Chicago here. And so you have a different kind of quote-unquote new Negro that's coming to university. And I was wondering about your periodization.
Yeah, so my research looks at 1901 when the first African American women enrolled through the end of the Great Depression decade. So I stopped about 1939. But as far as the nadir, we're speaking of the period between late 1800s, early 1900s, when lynchings were at an all-time high, when disenfranchisement was high. Most African Americans couldn't vote at all, really, in that period. And so there was definitely a sense of racial consciousness and a sense of trying to, particularly for African American female students, to try to recruit and get more African American women to come to the university. But it's also important and interesting to note that most of the earliest African American students came from Missouri, right? And so for them coming from a state like Missouri, coming to Illinois, even though the experience was not necessarily great at Illinois, it was better than it was in Missouri, right? And so not just Missouri, but one particular high school, Sumner High School, was where the vast majority of the earliest black students enrolled in the U of I. And so when we think about the Chicago Renaissance, we think about moving from the 1900s to 1910s into the 1920s and 1930s, when we know that race riots were happening in Chicago, the mentality, the consciousness was changing of blacks in general. Those black students that came from Chicago definitely brought that attitude and that spirit with them to the university. So when we look at the archival records of newspaper clippings that said black students are protesting, black students are suing the university for not being able to eat in the local restaurants, right? So we see all of these things happening in the late 1920s and in the 1930s, which really precedes all of the black student activism that we see in the 50s, 60s, 70s that really gets more attention and more press. But definitely we see that change in mentality from being not, I don't want to say not militant at all, but not as militant, to definitely a more militant student, black student here at the U of I in the 1930s.
Do you think that the university was intentional in the type of student that it recruited in the earlier days? I hear you talk about in the 20s and in the later periods students were getting more radical. I just wonder if there was some intentionality from administrators not being ready for that sort of level of radicalism, and they intentionally targeted certain type of students and men.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Speaking to Albert Lee, actually, why he is such a great figure for Black students here at the university, but why he's also considered controversial, which is what Vanessa alluded to, is the fact that the university did accept the majority of their students, one, from Sumner High School, because they knew the type of student they were getting, right? They knew they were getting students who were used to segregation, right? They were getting students that they didn't initially believe were going to press too much against segregation here at the university. So that's definitely part of the narrative. But also, the first African American students from Chicago that enrolled at the U of I believe the very first one is in 1920, or in the early 1920s. And so there are no Black students that come from Chicago before then. So they're all from either Southern Illinois, or they're from Sumner, or they're from Missouri. And so, again, with that whole mentality shift, with the New Negro movement, with the Chicago Renaissance that was going on, you had people like Ahmaud Brown, who was pushing the university to enroll students from Chicago. We don't have any students that came from Chicago until the 1920s. And the earliest students enrolled in the late 1800s. The first African American student enrolled in the late 1800s. And so that's a almost 30-year period where we don't see any Black students coming from Chicago. But because, they were becoming more militant and more radical, they said, hey, this is our state university too. We should have access. And so you see people like Ahmaud Brown who are pushing for that in the 1920s and 30s.
I don't know if you know this or not. I'm told that she was related to Henry Ossawa Tanner. How is that relationship? Where did how was that?
Yeah, so Henry Ossawa Tanner, the famous African-American painter, was, I believe, her second cousin, if I'm not mistaken. So yes, so the Tanner family was a very prominent Philadelphia family. That's where she was from. Also related was, and I feel like I'm going to mess her name up. My apologies now. She was a national president of Delta Sigma Theta, and she was also one of the first Black women to earn a PhD. And I cannot think of her name right now. It escapes me. But so the Tanner family, yes, in general, was a very prominent elite Black family from Philadelphia, and a lot of the Tanners. So they actually retained the name. So her middle name is actually Tanner, because of the family's prominence. They wanted to make sure that the name continued, essentially. So yes, she is related to him.
Are you thinking about Sadie, T.M. Allison?
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, that's who I'm thinking of. So yeah, she's also related. They're also related, which is interesting because Sadie T.M. becomes the national president of Delta Sigma Theta, and then Ahmaud Brown becomes the national president of Alpha Kappa Alpha. So they're in the same family, but national presidents of two different competing organizations.
I think you've all been very patient and contributed a lot here. We were scheduled to go until 8:30. It's past that. But our speakers and others are here to talk, visit the archives, look at the exhibits. Thank you very much. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you. And thank you all for coming.